Hello everyone. I'm waiting for the little spinny thing to stop. All right, yay, we're here. I missed you all last week. Welcome back to my messy space that I tried to clear out and just stopped. Working from home is fun, right? All right, so we're going to try to accomplish a lot today, and I'm watching the clock because I know I have a 25-minute window. Before I have to go on to a book study I'm doing at my church. If you're interested, it's called Walk in Love. It's about Episcopal beliefs and practices. It's very interesting. Anyway, so that's something else. So today we have a lot to accomplish, and thank you to Hillary for covering the previous two chapters in a really interesting way with lots of interactive things. So thank you, Hillary. All right, so as I said, we're going to try to do 3 today and 3 on Thursday to wrap up, and then that's it for this book. We can certainly keep conversations going from there if this has stirred some things up for you, and I'm really grateful for everyone who's been reading along. I did not see any questions this time, and so if you think of something or if I missed it, please just drop it into the comments. I'm going to double check my phone to make sure something didn't go there. And we'll just see how it goes. All right, so here we go. So we're starting with chapter 15, EDMR. So without getting like too deep into what it is, we're gonna get there a little bit, but it's basically eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. Try to say that 4 times fast. Hi, Diane. So the long and short of it is that they found that rapid eye movement can help manage stress while recovering from trauma. And they found a link between EDMR and or this rapid eye movement and what happens when you're asleep in a deep sleep. And so EDMR kind of tries to get at the heart of that. So it has something to do with your finger coming up close during these rapid eye movement things and moving it back and forth. And basically, what they found through their studies was that EDMR helps to make, it says on page 252, make painful recreations of the trauma, the thing of the past. So through EDMR treatment, which it sounds like is an average of like 12 times, he had someone do it 6 to 8 times and found that to be incredibly fast. But basically, the person is able to revisit that trauma and sort through it in a way that it becomes like a more complete memory. Because as we've talked about in the past in this book, traumatic memories come in bits and spurts and they're disorganized. So EDMR will help to reorganize that trauma and help them to deal with it. But the thing that I found very interesting about EDMR is that the person, the practitioner doing it, doesn't need to necessarily know what's happening in the mind of the person experiencing it. So, in other words, a person who is going through EDMR therapy, so they've got this finger here, their eyes are moving rapidly, they're sorting through all of this trauma, and they may have a bodily response. They don't have to explain what's happening. What the practitioner does is tells them to notice feelings. So they'll say, notice that. That's a key term. Notice that, which when we head into the next chapter with yoga, I find that interesting that those two things are quite similar, that you're noticing things and you don't have to name to anyone what you're noticing. It's just important for you yourself to notice what you're feeling or thinking. So that's the key instruction. And he said that the therapist doesn't need to hear what it is that they're experiencing. They don't need to explain why they're upset. They just need to be able to sort through it. So on page 255 of the book, I thought this kind of laid out what it is pretty well and some good conclusions of it. It says you need to, well, first of all, he talks about how a therapist really needs to recognize whether hearing the stories of patients is really about the therapist, like trying to get some kind of self-satisfaction out of it. And if that's your reason, hey Megan, if that's your reason for listening to people's stories, he says you're probably better off like going to a bar and buying someone a drink and saying tell me your trouble, or going to a coffee shop and buying someone some tea or coffee and say lay it out for me. Because that's not, a therapist doesn't need to like fulfill themselves in that way. The goal of the therapist is to help that person be healed, not necessarily hear all the nitty gritty parts of the story. So EMDR, I keep saying EMDR on 255, it loosens up something in the mind and brain that gives people rapid access to loosely associated memories and images from the past and puts it in a larger context or perspective. People may be able to heal from their trauma without talking about it. You don't have this talk therapy happening necessarily in this kind of therapy. And it said that this was interesting. It can help even if there's not a relationship of trust built between the patient and the therapist. And he talks about how when he was learning to do this, he did it with a person. He did the EMDR therapy with a person, and the person was kind of resistant to him in some ways, but kept going with it. And when the therapy was over and they reflected, his patient said to him basically like, "You're an ass," but it worked. So um, it because that talk isn't involved, the trust doesn't as much trust doesn't have to be there. So, and he said that you could even have a patient and therapist doing this who have a linguistic barrier, as long as the therapist can communicate that, notice that instruction, which is pretty cool. And then he starts to talk about the significant decrease in PTSD for the people who have used this kind of therapy, which Megan says that's amazing good news. I agree. This is like, it almost feels too good to be true, right? Like, but in the studies of this, it's showing that people who have PTSD can be really helped by this. And it even says that that his conclusion, and many conclusions are saying that it's way more effective than medication such as Prozac, and perhaps in the long run cheaper, because if you're I don't know how much it costs to get this kind of therapy done, but if you're looking at 20 and 30 years of Prozac, it sounds like his argument would be that gets really expensive. And so even from an economic argument, which he kind of throws in there every now and then, that EMDR might be a better alternative. So I found that pretty interesting. I totally have a kid coming up the steps. Okay. So the long and the short of it is it takes those fragmented memories and it puts them together in a coherent event, which helps the person then be able to kind of move on and deal with those things in a healthy way. So he says now EMDR is a treatment for PTSD that is sanctioned by the Department of Veteran Affairs, which is pretty impressive. One of the things about streaming that along together, yeah, Diane says you wonder if insurance covers this kind of therapy. I'd love to hear from someone if you have experience with that. One of the things about completing that memory strand and making it cohesive that he says is important is that over time, and many of you, if you really stop and think about it, can kind of come up with your own experience in this that makes sense. Over time, memories can evolve and change, is what he says. Memories can evolve and they change. And so if you have PTSD from something that happened 20 or 30 years ago, the way that memory comes to you, especially when it's fragmented, it makes it really hard to make a cohesive memory that you can then kind of digest and process. He says that if we remember when we were talking about the brain, that PTSD is the result of a reorganization of your central nervous system based on having experienced an actual threat of annihilation or someone else being annihilated, which then reorganizes your self-experience as helpless in the interpretation of reality. The entire world becomes a dangerous place. So your memory is just not, it's very disorganized and evolves and changes to protect you. And his argument is that EMDR can actually help a lot with that. And he gave some case studies. I'm going to try to keep moving on. Oh, Rhonda says, I've been trained in EMDR and have found it helpful in working with clients. Rhonda, I wonder if you could think of a way to even unpack that for us a little bit more without like breaking any confidentiality. Like, how have you had to use it over a long series of sessions? And if so, do you find that each one gets more and more helpful? I'd love to hear more about that. So yes, integration. It sounds like this kind of therapy helps with integration. And that's really amazing. And then he connects it with that REM, that REM, that deep sleep. So he says on page 263 that bilateral stimulation of EMDR can alter brain states in a manner similar as that seen during REM sleep. Then there's now good evidence that EMDR should be able to take advantage of sleep-dependent processes, which may be blocked off or ineffective in PTSD sufferers, to allow effective memory processing and trauma resolution. So he says, basically, this watching of the fingers and holding an image in one's mind might actually be able to reproduce what's happening in your dreaming brain. So it's pretty cool. All right, so watching my time, I'm doing good. I'm trying not to ramble too much. Chapter 16, learning to inhabit your body, yoga. I'm not gonna lie, when I was reading this, I was like, dang, I should have had Hillary do this chapter because she's like the yoga expert. When this is all over, or today, actually later tonight after my other book study, I'm going to hop on here and post a couple of like chair meditation yogas that Hillary's put on the Hive before, that kind of taps into some of that deep breathing that he talks about and noticing things in your body. And I'm also going to check to see, I believe that there's still like a first session of that yoga masterclass that you can access for free. I'm going to check in on that, but we do have a yoga masterclass if that's something you're interested in accessing. So just putting that out there for you. But oh, Rhonda said a lot of things. Thank you, Rhonda. She says with EMDR, it's especially useful in working with clients who have a lot of difficulty verbalizing their feelings, who've struggled with memories and trauma for a long time. Oh, I'm sorry. So it's this. That makes so much more sense. It's not this. It's this. Okay. That makes more sense for the rapid eye. Thank you, Rhonda. That's really helpful. So, and I would also be curious if you are listening now or you revisit this later, anybody who's experienced this kind of therapy. I definitely have friends who talk about it. I haven't experienced it, but I have met people who speak very, very positively of this therapy. So if it's something that you would be willing to share with us, we would love to hear that, but certainly don't want to pressure anyone. All right. So with yoga, yeah, Megan, we'll get that up. The deep breathing and that notice that language is something that's important to yoga. So interestingly enough, he talks about helping veterans with this and people who've experienced PTSD be more in tune with their bodies by using yoga. And he talks about doing it at Camp Lejeune, which is like that's where I live. I live right down the road from Camp Lejeune. So it's pretty interesting. But he starts to talk a lot about your body and how, the whole backbone or the whole reason that we started reading this book was talking about how trauma is locked in our bodies, and our body keeps the score. And so your body holds on to those memories even if you're not consciously necessarily holding on to them. And he says that yoga can really help with that, but people who have experienced trauma who are doing yoga need to do so very carefully and very slowly, because they may find that certain poses just unlock a floodgate of memories for them, or that they really have a hard time entering into certain poses. And so they have to really listen to their body about why. And he talks about one of his patients, Annie, how when she was doing yoga, she didn't like it at first, I don't think, and then she kept going with it. And she said, my body has something to tell me. And he talks about how, certain poses like with your pelvis, or interestingly enough, happy baby. I'm tempted to lay on the floor and show you happy baby, but I'm not going to. So, like you lay on your back and you have your knees up and you're just kind of rolling from side to side. And I was picturing like a baby giggling during it. And he said that this is an insanely hard pose for a lot of people who have been abused to do, because you're not, there's nothing about your body that's like in a protected mode there. You're just there, right? And so it doesn't feel safe. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But he talks about regulation of your breathing and of your body, and how yoga for most people will help with their breathing. When you inhale, you stimulate your SNS, which results in an increase in your heart rate. And when you exhale, you stimulate the PNS, which decreases how fast the heart beats. And with yoga, you can see that kind of stabilizing, right? There's an interesting chart, I should say first, sorry, on page 270, which shows what your heart rate variability looks like when you're well regulated, what it looks like when you're upset, which it just speeds up so much it almost looks level. So a well-regulated person, it's like this. When you're upset, it's like this. When you have PTSD, it's just like this. It's really shallow. It's out of sync. It's like way below level. And then when you have PTSD and you're reliving it, it's like this and then this. So it's pretty interesting. And he says that yoga is really important because the way that you breathe, so getting control of your breath, we've done a lot of breathing meditations here on the Hive, that it can improve problems with anger, depression, anxiety, and that yoga can positively affect such wide-ranging medical problems like high blood pressure, elevated stress hormone secretion, asthma, and lower back pain. But he said that there had been no psychiatric journal that had published any kind of scientific study on this until 2014, with yoga and PTSD until 2014, which seems, again, crazy late, but there it is. So anyway, he talks about Shavasana. So Shavasana is it's like my favorite part of yoga. It's like when you get to lay on the ground like this or like this and you don't move and you just relax. I remember the very first time I did it, I was like, this is insanely uncomfortable to me. And then I got more comfortable with it and I really like it. But he said that they would they did this experiment where they were measuring people's their HRV, or their heart rate variability, by putting little monitors on their arms during Shavasana. And he said that instead of relaxing in those folks with PTSD, he found there was just too much muscle activity. They weren't going into a state of quiet repose, he says on 273. Instead, their muscles were still prepared to fight, this unseen enemy. So he said, again, a major challenge in recovering from trauma is to be able to feel safe enough to engage in that state of total relaxation. this is openness, right? Like everything is open, and that's dangerous if you've experienced trauma. So he talks about Annie, this person and her journey through yoga, and being connected to her body and being more open with it. He shows about the brain effects on yoga, which was pretty cool. Um, and just that ability to understand your emotions, to think about your breathing, to think about what your body's trying to tell you, to intentionally notice things. One thing that was also really helpful is he said that for people who have experienced trauma, when they go to a yoga class, their yoga teacher needs to be someone who's really talking through things, like explaining how many breaths this pose is going to last. And that way, if it hurts, the person can decide, do I keep leaning into it? Like they see a clear end to it, or they can opt out. And also, a good yoga teacher isn't going to push someone to do something that doesn't feel right to them, and keeps telling them to listen to their body and don't do anything that their body says no to. You can try it another time. Megan says, this makes me think of coherent breathing method. This particular content is making me feel so hopeful about what our human bodies can do for ourselves and for each other. Yeah, our bodies are crazy, amazing, right? Like they can hold on to so much, but they do it to protect us. So if we can help our bodies to let it go, we're so much healthier and able to live much healthier lives. So this is really amazing stuff. All right. Watching my time. I'm doing good. I'm moving faster than I want to because there's so many awesome things here. All right, chapter 17. This chapter has a lot in it, and I honestly thought about telling y'all, let's just pause and do a whole session just on this one. So I'm going to say a few things about this chapter 17, which largely focuses on something called IFS, or internal family systems. And then I think that I will, either tonight or tomorrow, post some resources on that. I actually went to an IFS conference back in October, which is where I finally got to meet Amy in person, and we went out for dinner for fry bread. It was awesome. But so I got to kind of experience some of this firsthand. I was invited by a colleague of mine who is a child therapist, and she's really gotten into this internal family systems work. So I'm going to try to talk about this quickly. So the basic idea of IFS, or internal family systems, is that you're a complete person, but within you there's all these parts that you have, and all of the parts are trying to protect your innermost self. Or your true self. They're trying to protect your true self. So if you are someone who has experienced trauma, all these different parts of you are going to try to protect that true self in a variety of different ways. And there are many different parts. He talks about some of the main parts that you hear about in IFS. One of them being managers. So he talks about managers, and all these things are protectors. He talks about managers. He talks about exiles. He talks about firefighters, and there's another one. Sorry. Okay. So anyway, so managers and firefighters and exiles. Exiles are parts of yourself that are there, but you've kind of pushed them back and have forgotten what they are. They're locked up. And so you deny what this part of yourself is at all costs. And so you lock it. You may not even know that it's there. So that is an exile. So there's that. Manager is, he says, if you look at 283 and 284, he does a good job of trying to succinctly describe what these are. So a protector will keep these exiles locked up. A manager is a critical and perfectionist manager that makes sure we're never too close to anyone to drive us to be relentlessly productive. So managers will keep us from getting too close to anybody that might unlock that exiles, or might unlock something in us that's problematic. The firefighters are the ones that are emergency responders. They act impulsively. They will burn the stinking house down to protect the true self at all cost. So, um, let's say, let's say that you are in a meeting. Okay, so I'm in a meeting today, real story, and someone said something that just set me off. I was very tempted to just burn the whole thing down by what I said. I really had to compose myself and breathe and think about what I was saying. But like if I'm talking about parts here, my firefighter was saying, this man is talking down to you. He's telling you how to do your job. He's talking to you like a child. You don't like that. Go after him, burn the whole thing down, go. And I had to kind of rein that in a little bit. So that's a firefighter will do and say anything to protect that true self. So the work of IFS is to figure out how to unlock that true self to get, but it asks all those different parts to speak to each other. When I first experienced this, I found it a little like woo woo. I was like, I have parts in me talking to each other. That feels weird. But that's essentially what it is. So I went to this session where we were asked to think about, I don't even remember what the question was, but it was basically like something or someone who you're struggling with, and write down why, or like draw a picture or whatever, and then you had a partner who you began to talk to about this. And when she and I were talking, she kept pushing me on with this thing that I was struggling with, like what what are you trying to manage? What part is trying to speak that you're not allowing to speak? To kind of get to the root of what my issue was with this person. And at the end of the day, my issue was, that I was recalling something I didn't like that had happened to me as a child. And this situation was drawing that back out for me. And so I was trying to push certain things down by not allowing them to happen, and other parts of me were coming out in a roaring angry way. So IFS is really interesting in that way. But the idea is, the this chapter is called self-leadership because the idea with IFS is you put that person in the driver's seat, and the therapist will aid the person in kind of sorting all these different parts out, but they're in the driver's seat. They're in control. They get to decide what gets unlocked, and what doesn't. And the idea is to let all those different parts or all those different emotions have a seat at the table to speak so that everything can kind of open up. I'll find some things for you to put out there that are a little more helpful in understanding that, because it's a pretty interesting concept. So anyway, there it is. And then finally, oh, I gotta go. He ends on talking about, or almost, he ends on talking about the exiled child. In this case, this person he was, oh, somebody fell, doing therapy with, that was being protected, and so walked through this IFS treatment. And then he also talks about rheumatoid arthritis and working with people to perhaps unlock some things so that they can be healthier. And then kind of concludes, our increased psychological safety and comfort reflected in a better functioning immune system. So going back to what he said in the very beginning, that if you've kind of walked through, you've done things to kind of walk through your trauma, or you've done things so that you feel psychologically safe because you've worked through some things. Are you then a healthier person physically? Is your immune system actually working better? Because he does argue that a lot of autoimmune diseases are flared by trauma, or trying to protect ourselves from trauma. So all right. There's a lot of yoga love on this comment thread. I agree. Yoga is pretty amazing, and I keep, every now and then I think about, maybe I should like I need to get back into yoga, or maybe one day I could teach yoga. I first got into yoga, and I need to pick it back up again because Hillary, who started the Hive, was my priest at the time, and she offered free yoga classes. And I just moved to the area, and I had just like quit my job to move to the area, so I'm like at home with a kid. I don't have a job. It's my only stress outlet, and it was amazing. Um, Go look on the Hive website, www.thehiveapiary.com, and look at some of our yoga resources. I'll put up some chair yoga that Hillary has done in the past on here. It's really doable. It's like you can do it. Anybody can do it. And there's some love for the Rumi quote because Rumi is amazing. So if you haven't read this yet, Rumi on 279. And I will see you for the last 3 chapters on Thursday. In the meantime, send us your quotes, send us your questions, and I'm off to another book study. Bye, everybody.